All right, good afternoon, everyone. Or if you're here in the West Coast, it's good afternoon. If you're zooming in from the East Coast, it's good evening, right? Oh, I have to, oh yeah, okay, let me redo that one more. All right. How do I, okay, you got them in. All right, cool. Thank you so much. Well, again, I want to extend a warm welcome to all of those who are joining us today, either in person or through Zoom, to this book panel, House on Fire, How Adventism Faith Responds to Race and Racism. I'm super excited to have such an distinguished panel here with me. But before we begin, just want to say a few things about this event. This event is part of the 7th annual Adventist Bioethics Consortium conference. And this conference happens annually, and it brings together healthcare leaders, clinicians, and scholars of bioethics from many of our healthcare systems in Adventist community to think deeply on bioethics issues that confront all of our systems together. And it also served the consortium itself serves as a learning hub for us to collaborate together to think about policy issues, about some of the most controversial issues that are confronting all of our faith-based systems in our time. So it is an invaluable organization that I think allows us to all struggle with the most pressing issues confronting us, such as health equity issues related to reproductive health care, right? As well as other most commonly talked about bioethics issues, such as the end of life. So the Adventist Bioethics Consortium's activities is coordinated by the Christian Center for Christian Bioethics here at Loma Linda University. And the mission of the Center for Christian Bioethics is to continue the teaching and healing ministry of Jesus Christ. And to that end, we put together learning opportunities such as events like this that brings people together to talk about a topic of interest in a healthcare setting. And today we're going to be talking about issues related to race and racism, and particularly not only in the church, but that is confronting our healthcare system as well. So the consortium currently consists of 11 healthcare church and higher educational institutions. And this conference will happen from starting tomorrow. Today is the pre-conference day on Monday and Tuesday, and we hope that you will continue to join us for all of our conference offerings in the next 2 days. If you haven't already, if you scan the QR code that is on the tables upstairs or on your badge, if you have already registered today, it should take you to the conference program. Or if you don't have access to the badge, please also visit our website, the Adventist Bioethics Conference website. If you Google search that, you'll be able to be taken straight to the conference website. So before we begin, I would like to introduce our moderator today, who is also the co-editor of the book that we're talking about tonight, Professor Dr. Master Maury Jackson. The Reverend Dr. Dr. Jackson is an ordained minister in the Adventist Christian Communion. He served as pastor for over a decade in congregations on both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. He researches, writes, and teaches in the area of practical theology. He studies the intersection between theology in the public square and Christian witness, as well as participation, appreciation, and activism and critical reflection. He uses the tools of theological reflection, moral evaluation, and cultural investigation to inform his study of ministry in practice. Now, Dr. Jackson's wide-ranging publications encompasses the issues of ecclesiology, systematic theology, history of Christianity, public theology, and the philosophy of language. I consider him to be one of the most brilliant religious thinkers of our time, and also my dear friend.
Good friends.
He brings a pastoral passion and compassion to everything that he does. In the way that he carries himself, he pushes me to want to be a better person and a better Christian. And through our rigorous conversations and debates over the years, he pushes me to be a better thinker and a scholar. So that's why I'm so very pleased to have my friend, Dr. Maury Jackson, here with us today, as we continue to have critical conversations about race and racism in the Adventist Church and our healthcare systems. Welcome, Dr. Maury Jackson.
Thank you. Thank you kindly, Dr. Ma. And as you were giving that introduction, I began to think about what would make, say, a sparring partner of Muhammad Ali at his best keep coming back to get beat up in the sparring. And it's probably because Muhammad talked about them the way Dr. Ma just talked about me, because we have good, vigorous discussions, and I always feel like I come out on the losing end. But nevertheless, thank you so much. I want to thank you. I want to thank those of you who have come to be a part of this session, and both in person and online. I also want to thank my co-editor, Dr. Nathan Brown. Nathan Brown is the editor of Science Publishing, and he gave me a call, and I'll tell a little about the history of the project, and I'll do that and introduce our panelists. But he gave me a call right after the death of George Floyd, and he wanted to engage in a conversation. He asked, actually, Maury, would you be willing to, I think he first asked if I would send him my doctoral project, which was on Adventist journals, official Adventist journals, and how they address contemporary moral issues, or failed to address contemporary moral issues. And when I sent it to him, he read it. That surprised me. I didn't know what he had in mind. And then he said, "Hey, I'd like to work with you and bring together a group of contributors to write on how Adventist Christianity has tools for an anti-racism movement." And so we played originally with a subtitle that used the term anti-racism, but we decided instead on a subtitle that just said how Adventist faith responds to race and racism. In that conversation, we discussed how the project should come together. I thought, well, here's what I would like. As many women contributors as men. We almost made that goal. I said, I'd like us to have contributors from every habitable continent on the globe, and those islands of the sea in the South Pacific and in the Caribbean. And that I wanted to highlight Adventist religious scholars who are at union level institutions, so that they're well in those people who are in their own union territories are well aware of the level of scholarship that I know from our conferences that we have of people who are not popularly known among the larger Adventist communion of Christians. And so we agreed to that, and we took a group of names. I want to thank all of the contributors who contributed to this project. Some who teach here. Dr. Ma, thank you for your contribution. Dr. Janice DeWhite. We've had a great menu of contributors. So I'll say something. I'll read something here, and then I want to introduce you to the panelists. Part of what I wanted to address is, has Adventist Christianity come of age where it is able not only to deal with topics like racism and the problems of racism within the communion of faith that we have, but also be contributors to helping to do social formation within the larger context in which we live and serve. And so let me read 2 paragraphs and then I want to introduce our panelists. This is from the introduction. While the traumatic and brutal beating of the late Mr. Rodney King, caught on tape by a bystander, was witnessed worldwide on television more than 30 years ago, it was before this age of widely distributed social media. It was also before the memory of this younger generation who witnessed the death of Mr. George Floyd. In the wake of this recent tragedy, we need our voices to join the call for anti-racism. Not only prophetic secular voices, but prophetic voices that emerge out of their commitment to a sacred tradition. After the infamous terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center, Pentagon, and Camp David on September 11, 2001, activist and academic Cornel West reflected about the United States of America. Quote, "It has grown big, it has grown strong, but has it grown up?" End quote. It is a question that should echo in its application in our own faith community. Adventist Christianity has grown big, but the question remains, has it grown up? This book is essentially the co-editors, our judgment that it has grown, it has come of age. And so the contributors who presented helped us to hear what sources that they are conversing with and how those sources inform them and how their faith informs the way in which they engage in this rich conversation of race and racism. So I want to introduce the panelists. To my right is my colleague at the HMS Richards Divinity School. We're blessed to have her, who has recently also published her own book with, I know it's not Routledge, but I'm failing now. It's Lexington Press. And you could share about that as well, because it is a wonderful work. But Dr. Marlene Ferreras. So Dr. Ferreras is with us. She's a graduate of many institutions, but did her PhD at Claremont School of Theology. Thank you so much, Dr. Ferreras. And to her right is my good friend. We went to undergrad together, Dr. Andy Lampkin. We were there at Oakwood College and then re-engaged, met up again at Claremont when I was finishing my doctoral work there. And Dr. Lampkin had finished his at Vanderbilt University. He has a chapter that he's contributed. I'm so thankful. They were on my short list. I knew that they would get in this book because if I had a negotiating power, someone else was going to go. Thank you. Along with Dr. Mark Carr. Now, Mark, I know you went, I don't know, what institution did you finish at? Virginia. All right, University of Virginia. That's right. Dr. Carr, I thank you. We're brothers from another mother. Every time I'm up in Alaska, I try to meet with you. We meet up, we miss each other, but we keep in good conversation. I thank you so much. We've had our conversations when you taught here at Loma Linda, and now you are working up in Alaska with the Catholic Providence St. Joseph Health. Providence St. Joseph Health. Yeah, thank you so much. And then at the end, the last person is my good friend and brother, Dr. Greg Hoenes. Dr. Hoenes finished his PhD at Claremont School of Theology, and he is an administrator in the church. We wanted to include voices in church administration who are progressive voices, who are well informed and well engaged. And so thank you again, all of you, for your contribution to this project. What I'd like to do for the rest of our time here today is give the panelists a chance to just share about their chapter with you, highlights that you would like to share. And then I would like you also, if you don't mind, to maybe talk about another chapter in the book project that you yourself found interesting and engaging. And then finally, if we could just talk about why we think this book might be relevant to those who have come to the Adventist Bioethics Consortium conference. We're pleased to be invited. It was an honor to be invited. And we do think that this is helpful for those who are engaging in bioethics and some questions we might have for healthcare. And so I will begin. I'll end my talk there and just begin with maybe you, Marlene, is that all right? Oh, yes. Yes, please. Thank you.
I just want to make sure that our online participants know that we are going to have plenty of time for Q&A and interaction with the panelists here. So if you have a question and you're coming here online, please post your question in the Q&A box, and I'll be here monitoring those questions, and then I'll ask the panelists those questions in the order that they come. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. All right.
Okay, so I'll begin. So you can see that there are other female contributors, and I'm not the token female, okay? Although I'm the only one here today. I'm a pastoral theologian. The title of my chapter is Pastoral Theology and Raciated Bodies. I think that there's several links and overlaps actually throughout the book that are encouraging to me from the perspective of a practical theologian. And that's, I think, a shift in the way that we do theology within Adventism, or at least what we respect most. It's mostly been applied theology, right? Where we have systematic theologians, philosophical theologians that are constructing ideas and putting together well-formulated doctrines, which are then passed on to those of us in the applied theologies. We're kind of like the basement dwellers of the theological tower. And then we get to just kind of, do this job of putting the rubber where the rubber meets the road, where it actually matters. It's also not valued, right? That's not where knowledge and academic sort of work happens. We just apply all of the insights and good theology that comes out of the other branches of theology. But throughout the book, and I know I'm making a very general sort of thing, but it's because I want to encourage you to actually read it, I see a turn in my church theologians, broadly speaking, and those who are contributing, taking lived experience seriously, allowing theology to emerge from the ground up. Because one of the arguments that I'm attempting to make in my chapter, a line I stole from you, is that enfleshed wisdom names a whole host of sins. And so we need to pay attention to our lived experiences and give them a whole lot more authority to dialogue and to challenge scripture and also these like set in stone kinds of doctrinal ideas that we have. Just to give you a broad sweep of what I've done in the chapter as a pastoral theologian, my main aim in the chapter was that anti-racism is an Adventist Christian imperative, and I think that it requires different methods of pastoral care that are really equipped to deal more adequately with complex suffering. In pastoral theology, and I've done a bit of a historical trace, but just picking up the nuggets of pastoral theology and what has mattered. The field has largely been focused on individualism, individual suffering. We see that even in the earliest places of how Christian communities cared for one another, right? And so you think about Paul's ministry to the congregation. He's giving guidance. We move into the patristic period. And at that point in time, pastoral care is getting systematized. But again, its main purpose is to help Christians live a moral and upright Christian life. And so then we turn to these tasks of the clergy, right? And as we turn to these tasks of the clergy, where the care of souls is taking place, it's also taking on a very private dimension. And we're engaging in practices such as sacraments of baptism, confession, the Eucharist, just to name a few examples. For those of you who have done some work with clinical pastoral education, you know that the two main forerunners in the field, Anton Boysen and Seward Hiltner, they're the texts we go back to, right? They're the ones that have influenced the field greatly. And what they have proposed is these images of care, for example, of the solicitous shepherd in Luke 15 as a model for care and counseling. And they focused on the functions of the caregiver of healing, guiding, and sustaining. And I won't get too far into that, but the only way we get critiques into what Boysen's doing with critiquing the living human document, how do we read ourselves and have this intrapsychic sort of conversation with ourselves to understand our behaviors and our spirituality and our dimensions, like the only way we get to critiquing that is by way of womanist and feminist theologians, right? Who then begin to say, well, guess what? I can't talk about, well, now I'm talking myself, like I cannot talk about or even write a chapter about racism without also naming a whole host of other sins, right? Because I have to deal with patriarchy within my community or other communities of color, right? There's that one thing. And then I also have to deal with sins of racism, but those are only two. There's a whole bunch of others. And so I bring in intersectionality, which moves, which the feminist and womanist theologians move us into care that is communal contextual. So looking at all the different ways that our communities are set up and the kind of suffering that is the cause of that suffering is the systems in which each of us are embedded, right? And our place in those systems account for, quote unquote, like the symptoms, right? So we can talk about depression, but guess what? Depression's quite understandable when you're constantly dealing with a socioeconomic status that you're just trying to survive, right? When your healthcare systems are such that you're constantly sick and there's no universal healthcare. I could go on, right? But the shift then is to say, let's look at the context. Let's look at the suffering. Let's also look at the resources that persons bring, the cultural resources that persons bring to the caretaking relationship, so that we don't assume that caretakers are like the mini gods dispensing healing to the people that are suffering, that are going through this soul suffering. One of the critiques that I most cared for is Carol Watkins Ali's critique of sustaining people through the harms of life, right? Holding them up as they navigate these really treacherous waters of suffering in our communities. And she said that that's just torture, right? We don't need sustaining care that just helps us to put up with a bunch of the nonsense that we're called to live into. What we need are liberative practices, right? And so we need a healing that requires liberation from oppressive structures, because what's sick is the structures. We need sustaining that goes beyond the pastor or whoever the caregiver is helping me to continue to just endure the pain. We actually need solidarity of caregivers who are going to act as advocates and who are going to take the caregiving relationship out into actually advocating for policy change and for changing the material, right, reality of our lives. That's the sustaining work. For guiding, like, who are you so presumptuous to sit and to caretake for me and dispensing what I need to do without first asking me? So, mind the resources that individuals and families bring to the caretaking relationship. And then there's discussion of nurturing and reconciliation and liberation. But what I want to maybe underscore in those is the work of reconciliation, because I think Carol Watkins Ali really touches on an important thing here. She's talking about reconciliation that is happening within, for her, in the Black community, where there's a divide that is socioeconomic and racial divides, even within her. She's talking about colorism, right? And also differences in economic power and access, right, within the culture. And then also across, right, cross-culturally. And that if we're seeking liberation, we've got to deal with reconciliation and ways to really not just confess our sins, right, but find ways to make right the wrongs. right? And to do that both within our cultures and again, cross-culturally. As far as what Adventists have to contribute, I just have two things, and I'm going to quickly go. I think Adventists spend an awful lot of time talking about unity of body and soul. I think we like that a lot. I think it's been central. I think it's been something that has really underscored why we've gotten into practices such as Sabbath, such as caring for our bodies as the temple of God, but we really haven't seen them as the spaces and the places where divinity breaks through. When we talk about the Jesus and the incarnation being both human and divine, we spend a whole lot of time on the divine part, not a whole lot of time on the human part, and whatever human was about Jesus, the wounds he got while he was in the body and later resurrected with those don't carry much weight, but I think that the Adventist church can do a whole lot with that. And then, of course, hope, right? When we talk about Adventists, it's in our name. We are, I think, right, attentive to the ways that God appears to us and continues to appear and unfold and teach us something about God's self, about community, about the role of the church in the world. And we've been stuck on chronology, right? Eschatology, chronology wise. But if you go back to communities, and if you're really wanting to look at the least of these, you need to go to poor women of color who are single. Okay. My book, Insurrectionist Wisdoms, is, like was mentioned, published by Lexington Press, does just that. It gathers in-depth interviews from women who are working on the assembly line of a maquila. I studied their spirituality, and I think they have insights for us on how to think about topological eschatology, how the future is emerging in the present, and what kinds of practices they engage in to resist the sorts of harms and deformation of even their own identity in the midst of these really awful conditions that they live in, and how they move through that. I'm not going to spend time on that, but that's what my chapter was. And I'll just hand it over now to Andy.
Thank you.
Thank you. Andy, just before you get started, you don't have, it's on. Okay, maybe I should do that. All right, thank you. Andy, just real quick before you get started, I want to say what you will also find in this book is an incredible bibliography. Some of the sources that each of our contributors have drawn from are cutting edge, real good, both in terms of the depth of what the disciplines they're coming from yield, and some of the more recent work. So thank you so much. Go ahead, Andy. Thank you.
First, thank you for the invitation. I'm honored to be here with this esteemed panel, and I'm honored to be a part of the book. It's excellent work, excellent work. I'll begin with the book actually gave me hope. A pause for effect. Seriously, the book actually gave me hope. For the first time in many ways, a group of Adventist scholars, a very diverse group of Adventist scholars, taking very serious the issue of race and racism and how it functions in American society. It gave me hope. I mean, it really did. And as you say, one of the things that stands out in the text is, again, the diversity of scholars who are reflecting on the topic, but the sources that they're bringing to bear. They're bringing modern and contemporary theological sources to bear, and that really stands out, and it gives me hope. I know I said that several times, but I mean it. I really do mean it. So I'll talk a little bit about what I was trying to do in my chapter. There's an inside joke there. Anyone who defended a dissertation there's a lot of approaches to defending the dissertation. One can come in and defend, right? You can go and fight. You'll probably lose. And I've seen that happen. Or you can explain your mistakes away and simply say, what I was trying to do was, whether you're trying to do it at all. So we had some fun around that, reflecting on our time as PhD students. It is, I won't go deep into this. Dr. Jackson and myself, we go way back to the Oakwood days. And so we've been talking about these kinds of issues for quite a while. So again, it excites me that it came together in this piece. And Mark and I were graduate students at the same time at very different institutions. I'm going off a little bit, but it seems like Claremont is just kind of taking over. Should we just call this place Claremont East? And so it's just me and you, Mark. It's just me and you, University of Virginia and Vanderbilt in the house. And so happy to be here. I begin my chapter talking about a very personal experience with racism. Basically, I was a teenager, and I won't go deep into the story. Hopefully you'll pick up the book and read it. But I grew up outside of the Chicago area, a few suburbs west of the city. And if you know Chicago is a racially divided and segregated city to this very day. That's just the nature of the city. See you, Tim. And you learn very early on to stay out of certain neighborhoods. I think it was Cicero, Illinois, again, one of the western suburbs in Chicago. When Martin Luther King came to that city, he said he saw the worst forms of racism there in the North. Just got to wrap your head around that. In a Northern American city. So again, me and a friend of mine, we were riding our bikes, actually, interesting enough, going to a bike shop. And I'm just skipping around in the story. On our way home, we rode our bikes through several suburbs, but on our way home, we were basically accosted as teenagers. A group of young men, they were hollering all types of incendiaries out of their car window, and you could imagine the N-word was flying. We were afraid. We were teenagers. We were just barely in high school, and then that was obscene in and of itself. But one of the people in the car decided to basically spit at us, and glob landed on the guy that I was with. And just what I remember is just we rode our bikes as fast as we could back home, back to our neighborhood where we felt safety and security. And the thing about it is, Dr. Jackson, you and I talked a lot about this. The thing about it is, it's just an ordinary experience of bike riding, right? And racism finds you. There was some time when in the 90s, there was a lot of discussion. Does racism still exist in America? I see a bunch of people smiling. Does racism still exist in society? Or are Black folk just complaining and making excuses for all of them? It exists. It finds you. We didn't go looking for it. We were teenagers. And 40 plus years later, I remember it like it was yesterday, because I was afraid for my life. And the only thing I did wrong was to be in the wrong place at the wrong time in a Northern American city, one that I love, by the way. And we could talk about that tension as the discussion goes on. And so I begin my chapter with that. And then I move into a discussion of the caste-like nature of racism in the United States. The caste-like nature, racism as caste, as racial caste or as social caste. And I move into that discussion, because one of the things we're trying to make sense of, and one of the things we have to account for, is the enduring nature of racism. You have to account for that. Slavery's over, right? The civil rights movement has ended. We made some strides, but it appears to still be around. So you have to ask yourself, why? What accounts for that? As scholars, what accounts for that? The caste-like nature of it. The society was built a certain kind of way, and so the society functions a certain kind of way. Is America a caste system like other countries' caste system? Probably not. But there is something to the argument, because you have to account for the enduring feature of racism in American society. You have to account for the prison industrial complex. You have to account for the health disparities and the health inequities. And we know a lot's going on in all of those, but you have to account for it somehow. And so that's a notion that a concept, a notion that we can work out and make sense of. And there's several authors I refer to, but that notion of an American racial caste go way back in American history, actually back into the 1800s. Alex Tocqueville, 1835. And then I move on to talk about 4 levels of racism. We often just think about racism from the perspective of an individual not liking another individual because of his or her race. And it's something to that. It's something to that, but racism is also tied to power. That's when it actually matters, actually. I'm not that sensitive if a person doesn't like me. I'm not that sentimental, right? But when I'm driving down the highway and I'm pulled over by a police officer, I don't want to be shot and killed on the street. When I go to the mall, I don't want to be followed around the mall where people just assume that I'm there and I'm up to no good, that I may steal something. When I apply for admissions to a school, or better yet, a job, or try to seek promotion, I don't want my race to get in the way then. So it's when it's tied to power that it actually matters. And it's those kinds of things that we need to be attentive to. So I talk about the various types of racism. And then I move to the theological piece. So the more theological piece says racism as idolatry and attack on God. And I reference a quote from Desmond Tutu. Another interesting thing, I think interesting about my piece, I bring together Desmond Tutu, Frederick Douglass, James Baldwin, and Ellen G. White in the conversation. So I bring them all into discussions, and they say some pretty interesting things. Desmond Tutu says this, all of this, he's talking about the creation story, the creation account found in Genesis 2. For those of us who do ethics, we understand that human dignity, human worth, and the like is kind of grounded in Genesis 2. All of this makes human beings unique. He's talking about the creation. It imbues each one of us with profound dignity and worth. Every human being has profound dignity and worth. As a result, this is what Tutu says, to treat such persons as if they were less than this, to oppress them, to trample their dignity underfoot, is not just evil, as it surely must be, because it is evil. It's not just painful, as it frequently must be for the victims of injustice and oppression, as it is. It is positively blasphemous, for it is tantamount to spitting in the face of God. That just grabbed me. tantamount to spitting in the face of God, to oppress God's creation, to not treat humanity with the dignity and worth that it deserves as God's creation. All you can say is, wow. Wow. What nerve. What nerve. It's sin. Real sin. And then I talk about some Seventh-day Adventist teachings and how they can be, how they relate to this topic. And I don't need to lift them here. In many ways, it's a reflection on Genesis 2 again, but I reflect on a couple Adventist social statements that basically, again, ground the fundamental value of human life. I think that's Adventist contributions in many ways to this topic. You have to start. You can start there, you can end this. Human beings have value and worth because God imbued it in us, period. And then I move into a brief discussion while we wait. And I don't even know if I gave the title of my chapter, Spitting in the Face of God While We Wait on Christ's Return. That's the title of my chapter, Spitting in the Face of God While We Waiting on Christ's Return. So to be disrespectful towards human beings while we wait, it just sounds strange, doesn't it? I see you shaking your head. It just sounds strange on the face of it, right? It just seems weird and odd. We're waiting on God on the one hand. It's Sunday, but I feel like preaching. I feel like preaching.
It goes on most Sundays. Don't worry. That's all right.
And Sunday keeps coming, right? Sunday keeps coming. It's a whole preacherism. While we wait on Christ's return, we need to fight the good fight to make the world a better place. That's how we basically end this chapter. I already talked about what gave me hope. You talked about another author in the book that grabbed us. It's this gentleman right here in the narrative ethics. So we won't say much about that. Maybe in the exchange we could pick up some of the themes. But Mark deals with narrative ethics, so he's going to talk about that. But it gives us a glimpse into how we see things from very different perspectives. And I think that's the case. You know, we focus on different things because we see things from very different perspectives. Why some might be more interested in this topic than other. He accounts for all those things. I think I covered it all. Did I cover it all?
You did. And I thank you so much. Yes, indeed. Mark's chapter is entitled Redemptive Storytelling in a Post-Truth Adventism. And I'll tell you, Mark, and Andy and I talked about his chapter because when it came in and I read it, immediately a memory of my history that was so painful that I had suppressed was actually around some older gentlemen when I was riding my bike, running me off the road and turning back around to spit on me. And it becomes one of those moments where the storytelling also helps us to be aware of areas of maybe trauma that we kind of just toughed it out and moved forward. And your chapter was situated to really help us wrestle with how to take stories and make them redemptive.
Thanks for the cue up. I wanted to shout out though for you and Nathan. Thank you, Yi-Shen, for helping this happen here. I know I used to be in your position. I know it's not easy to do. Thank you. And Nathan had a lot of courage to do this, and as did you. So thank you both. I want to give a special shout out to my friend. So many times I have stumbled into idiotic white male stuff that my friend has helped me with. There's no way I can understand who I am and who I am as an American except through some of the things that Andy has taught me. And I appreciate that. Thank you. The power of story. is the central part of what I try to do in my chapter. Seventh-day Adventists love stories, but we don't do a lot with them. We prefer propositional truth. It's much cleaner. It's much easier to teach, and we avoid stories. I learned this telling stories at summer camp with the young people. And I knew that I had them when they would lean forward into my story with Taught by a Tiger. Anybody remember Taught by a Tiger? Jungle Thorn. Those stories, right? And I'd say, now, boys and girls, the moral of the story is, and guess what I would see on all of their faces? They're gone. They're gone. They're not interested in the moral of the story, the part that I think is so important to teach them about the story. This is what the story is about. Let's just try telling the story. And if the story has compelling truth, the story will do its work. And I've been grabbed by that idea for a long, long time. And when Maury asked if I would be interested in writing a chapter, I didn't even let him finish the sentence. I was all in. What do we do, though, with messy stories? How do we navigate the messiness of story? And this is part of the problem. So I try to illustrate the messiness of story through the primary central narrative of the story of racism in American Adventism. What is that story? What's the central story to Adventism in America about race and racism? I asked that question to hundreds of people in formal situations and in informal situations, and I got different answers from different groups. Almost always, white people had an individual story from their academy days or some such thing like that. And if they were pressed for a story, they would slowly work their way around to the morning star. Think about it. The prophet's own son piloting a boat made through the funds of the General Conference to go south on the Mississippi River to the dark counties to save them. That's a pretty compelling story, especially for white folk. That's the story I learned when I'm adopted into this church. I came into this church and gave myself to this church. And when I asked, I wasn't naive to racism, but I was still young. And I asked, and they said, yeah, oh, no, we're not racist. We had people involved in the anti-slave, movement and so on. Yeah. Continue asking questions, and the Lucy Bayard story came to the surface, just for the fun of it. How many of you have heard of the Lucy Bayard story? Raise your hand, please, if you have heard of the Lucy Bayard story. I want you to look around. Look around in the room. Those of you who have your hands up, hold it up high. The Lucy Bayard story. Why have not more of us heard about the Lucy Bayard story? If you don't know the story, you have to read the chapter. The long and the short of it is you won't like it because it is one of our hospitals rejecting a person who was a church member, but she was Black. Sorry, can't serve you here. But the story continues to be messy because when you hear the story, notice who tells it and what the outcome of the story is. Because when a white person tells the story, almost always, they chose to go across town to the historically Black hospital. They chose it. We did offer them a place in the basement where we would bring them a meal occasionally. And they chose to go across town, where she died some 43 days later. In this essay, I learned to appreciate Adventist historians in ways that I have not in the past. I think if anybody can save this church from itself, it's our historians. And if we listen to them at what they find, and if we help them fine tune what our stories can mean for us and what they can do for us. So that's part of what I wanted to do. And then I explored the story of regional conferences. And I am no expert in regional conferences, but I can tell you this from my wide experience, the reason they exist is because Blacks wanted leadership in the church. That's why they existed. Turns out the historians that I read about how regional conferences came to exist, think about this, it was in the 40s, wasn't it? It was a long time ago. There was no one else in charge in the church other than white people, had complete control of the church. And the decision was made to shape regional conferences. So how is it? Anyway, the messiness of the stories and getting to the truth of the story. How do we work with the stories that we have? There's not a lot of material in narrative theology and ethics, particularly when it gets to pitting it against more propositional orientation. But Stanley Hauerwas and some of his co-authors has done more than most. Let me read just very briefly. In their view, it is messy, but it is still possible. And in fact, they would argue a better way to approach. From page 133, they write, any story which we adopt or allow to adopt us will have to display, one, power to release us from destructive alternatives. Benjamin Baker wrote the definitive essay on the Lucy Bayard story. He did so at the commissioning of the Washington Adventist Hospital, if I understand correctly. And he has now offered the most definitive story with historical documents. So the narrative has to have the power to release us from the destructive alternative stories that we tell. If there's dispute about what really happened, the proper telling of the story should release us from the destructive realities. Point number two, ways of seeing through current distortions. A story should help us see through current distortions. Number three, room to keep us from having to resort to violence. A story should help avoid a resort to violence. And number four, a sense for the tragic, how meaning transforms power. And it's in that last point that I believe the Lucy Bayard story has to be the meta story for Seventh-day Adventism and racism in America. Because the tragedy of what happened in the Lucy Bayard story and the aftermath, and you have to read the history of what happened in the aftermath and how it affected a specially called Spring Council 6 months later, where they decided to form regional conferences. The tragedy of that and the reality of that story should shape us in ways that our propositional truths simply have failed to shape us. Maybe that's enough said.
Thank you. Well, my good friend Greg, and as I told the panel, I think you've known me the longest because you've known me since high school. Greg is helping us think about the story we tell ourselves about this planet. And I love how you tied in the challenges of environmental racism and in your chapter, A House on Fire in a Burning World, how anti-racism work benefits from our commitment to environmental justice, eco-justice, and sustainability. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you. And wow, to follow all of that, I should have chose a better seat. I'm going to make a mental note of that for my next panel. They'll probably reverse the order or something. I was not a little intimidated by the proposition of writing a chapter on this, being an American white cisgendered male, born in the very hospital that said no in your story, Mark, and realizing just the very hidden ways in which I, who said I wasn't a racist, probably was, and certainly my family. So when approached, I wrestled with Maury a little bit about that, and he's marvelously generous and persuaded me to give it a go. I came at this a little bit sideways. My interest in graduate school was initially food and spirituality. And I found out, much to my chagrin, that there was a ton of work on that already. I just wasn't very well read, as it turned out. And so it just kind of morphed over time. And I narrowed it finally down to the question of, why are Seventh-day Adventist people interested in food for the sake of health and maybe longevity, but not apparently interested in food for purposes of ethics, and not interested in food for purposes of environmental preservation? Well, I found out that there were ethicists doing some work. How about that? Melissa Broughton in her volume and some others did some animal ethics dealing with environmentalism. But it's a small group of people. And Jan Sabate here is also doing work correlating environmental harms with diet. So there are people doing work, I'm relieved to say. But the journey took me through the question of why, and of course you have to look at apocalypticism and a bunch of other factors there, but much to my surprise, and this may be a shock to those of you from Loma Linda too, it turns out that the Seventh-day Adventist Church is a white American Protestant evangelical fundamentalist church. I'll let that sink in. I somehow had missed that. Yeah, I'm raising all sorts of questions as to why I'm actually on the panel, aren't I? We're an American denomination, and the context of its formation was dominantly European white at the time. And the values espoused were dominantly white European at the time, including values of Western expansionism and so forth. And I began to look at some of the history and the complicities, and dialogued with people like Tim Golden and some others who have done work on, post-Reconstruction acquiescence to Jim Crow and some of these kinds of things within Adventism. And of course, ultimately, the segregation that followed within the church and some of these things. And it was really devastating, because I had always told people I'm not a fundamentalist. I've always had a more open outlook. My dad was one of those guys, rare guys in the church, a doctor, graduate of Loma Linda University, who thought it was okay to ask questions. So that became a saving grace for me growing up. So that's how I got to the question of environmental connections. When I realized that that's what the church was, I began to really dig into why then that kind of identity and structure worked against environmentalism and worked against and just even talking about these subjects as political, and they've become very political in recent times. There's also a shift or a kind of angle that I've come at this politically, and I know that may be controversial, but I was one of those white men who thought when Barack Obama was elected president that we had turned a corner. I thought when you got the good old white folk of Iowa voting for a black man, something's changed in America. I know, laugh at me. I was naive. But I also found myself weeping in class at Claremont, weeping after November of 2016, realizing that no shift had occurred. In fact, the backlash was worse than what had been prior. And I got my first Black Lives Matter pin, which I should be wearing today, but I have it safely kept in my drawer. So I approach this also then from the political dimension, because what's happened in our society is everything has become politicized. We can't talk about environmentalism without that being a liberal conservative issue. And those things have been so distorted that they don't even mean what they mean anymore. They've moved so far to the right. I just think if we would really give a little thought to how far our church and our country have moved right, we would be stunned. Just stunned. I know I am. So what I thought to do in this chapter was begin to look at the way in which racism is structured, particularly in environmental terms. And environmental racism became the kind of tool for reading that. It was a term given by Benjamin Chavez Jr. or the second in the 80s over a fight as to where some very toxic materials were going to end up being buried. And of course, if you do a little research, and it won't take much, you'll find out that the vast majority of embedded ecological harms are in communities of color, particularly African American communities. So on top of all the stresses of racism and all the other factors that go into environmental racism, you actually have communities that are embedded next to toxins and toxic environments. Think Flint, Michigan, and some of these kinds of situations. Now, see, if Flint had been Beverly Hills, the entire resources of the United States would have been summoned overnight. 1 trillion gallons of groundwater would have been pumped out and filtered and disposed of, and Beverly Hills would be given. I mean, you know what we would go to for Beverly Hills, but Flint, Michigan, children are still dealing with the consequences, right? So we have Black and brown bodies not only suffering from sort of these personal racisms and structured racisms, but the environmental effects complicate the racial picture, because now we have greater problems with health, greater problems with economy and family. It takes a lot if you have a sick child to go to the hospital multiple times. You might lose a job, or you might miss out on something. So that became the matrix with which to look at it. And then the antidote would be, sort of an ecological and environmental reversal, looking at that from a pro point of view, and not in the kind of classic white savior complex, green movement type of way, which really dictates in some respects how environmentalism will be approached and ecology will be approached, but in ways that listen, ways that are embedded in community, ways that seek to be inclusive in the way in which seats at the table are assigned on these issues, ways that seek to redistribute ecological harms. I have a feeling the country would get a whole lot more ecological if our folks in power, which, by the way, are overwhelmingly white in Washington, if we got to dump toxic waste near their homes. I have a feeling all of a sudden things would shift there. But that's what I did with my chapter, essentially. I just asked the question. I also looked at Jones and O'Toole and their matrix for white supremacy culture, and the way in which that plays itself out, both in dominant systems religiously, but also in every other sphere in business and economy, and the way then that plays itself out in racism and environmental racism. So my invitation in my chapter is for all of us to commit to a realization that our earth is finite, that the values of eco-justice give some kind of status to things apart from human want and desire. Actually consider the worth and merit and ethics of animal life, even non-animal, non-living things and environments. And that environmental justice really seeks to bring people to the table and to distribute harms in ways that might combat environmental racism. So that's what I did. I had a lot of resonance with many chapters in this book. I think just to quickly mention a couple of things, Mark's work on narrative, for example, was very helpful. I want to quickly point out, not to discount anything he said, but there are narratives that go the other directions too. Some of them we tell ourselves. So one of the narratives that we're constantly rehearsing to ourselves as Adventists is this notion that Jesus is coming again soon. That's the narrative we tell ourselves. Well, if that's really true, why should I be concerned with where toxic waste is put, or whether a species of frog goes out of existence, or whether the Amazon is being cleared for soybeans so that I can eat more beef? What difference does any of that make if Jesus is going to come again very soon and cleanse the earth with fire and remake everything and give it to me all over again, right? So there are narratives that are need to be interrogated, that are problematic in terms of our ability to be anti-racist and certainly to take care of the garden that we were given in the beginning. It's complex. I don't want to pretend that these things are simple. Very, very complex. And this is perhaps where Marlene's approach is really much more helpful, deeply contextualized, deeply understood in terms of people's experience and stories and participation in process. I had a lot of resonance too with Claudia Allen and Andy Lampkin's notion of caste. That struck me as particularly powerful because when it really comes down to it, the dollar has an awful lot of power for us, not just ecologically and racially, but religiously. And I am always tempted to be a little sacrilegious around that, substituting our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ for something else, because I think sometimes that's really what it comes down to. And just a final note, I guess, on that, it's really economic inequality that drives a lot of the issues that we have going in our society today, especially in relationship to caste. I don't like the term race. Time magazine featured a cover a number of years ago, or Newsweek, touting a study from Harvard saying that mitochondrial DNA studies demonstrated that all humans come from one mother, and they called that mother Eve. Now, I suppose we could go to some more evolutionary sources on the humanoid type things and the genetic influences and spaces in Europe and so forth, but I'm not an expert on that. And I think I'll still steer clear of further mention of that. But we are one race of people who've developed very unequal ways of being in the world. And money has much to do with that. Privilege has much to do with that. And to the extent that I continue to grow in my understanding of how to navigate and combat that, I pray God will continue to use what voice I have. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank you. We're gonna shift a little, but I wanted to do another reading and pick up on something Greg just said. So this is again, out of the introduction, Adventist Christianity holds to a contested sacred tradition that teeters between apocalyptic visions and prophetic visions. Both of these biblical visions bring moral and ethical imperatives that guide communal living as a community of faith and articulate voices for the larger world. While this book speaks to and within a community of faith, it also speaks beyond our community and into a world that houses all God's children. And I guess I like how you pointed out that those stories we tell can go either way. And I like to think of John the Baptist as the first Adventist teaching us how to prepare the way of the Lord. And if you look at the commentaries on his sermons, when he finished, they said, well, what should we do? Well, if you have two coats, give one away. And everything that he dealt with was about really social justice. That's how you prepare the way of the Lord. And so I appreciate that we have had voices that have weighed in, thinking of ways to missionize Adventist Christianity beyond littering cities with pamphlets. Okay, now, there you go. Yeah. We can, yeah, exactly. I also want to speak about something that Sally Haslinger did in her book that helps us to think about, as I think of what happened with the students here, the contributors here. Sally Haslinger talks about three ways of talking about race. She speaks of race eliminativism, namely to say we ought to eliminate talk about race because there's only one race. She talks about race constructivism and race naturalism, and I noticed that I would say the majority, if not all, of the contributors seem to think about the social constructive aspect of this race discourse and took it as an assumed fact, and then from there began to engage in the conversation. There's one other contributor, and I don't know, Yi-Shen, do you want to say something? I think it would be good for them to hear about your chapter just a little, and then we'll open it up for questions. I know we have some online. We'll also open it up to others, but yeah, thank you.
How dare Dr. Jackson put me on the spot like this? Well, maybe, instead of talking about my chapter, I would like to help begin the conversation by perhaps asking Dr. Carr, and I think this question may be relevant for Dr. Ferreras as well, on your chapter on being attentive to human experience, right? We live in America in this moment in a post-truth society, right? So if we're talking about narratives, it seems like we're very good at creating narratives, generating new narratives. And so I kind of want to ask, how can we deal with stories ethically? And what is the relationship between stories and the truth, right? How do we deal with stories in a way that is accountable, in other words, to the truth? And I'd like to hear the two of you speak on that question.
That is very good, because my students love to talk about my truth. What is that?
It's one of my favorite sayings as well. I just need to speak my truth. Yes, you have a perspective. You have a grasp of what's happening. It's not the only story out there. Within the context of my chapter, and within the context of regional conferences and Adventism in America, the truth that is portrayed by the living out of Adventism in Black Adventism redeems the entire church in North America, because the way they have lived out their life is truer. Can I use that? Than the alternative. And by that, I mean, when you apply the idea that narrative theology and ethics can serve to discriminate between this story and that story, Black Adventism has redeemed racist American Adventism because they stayed. They stubbornly refused to leave. And that in and of itself portrays a character finer than the other people who have had stories framing their character. This is something I got from Cone, I think, from the cross and the lynching tree, because he makes the same argument that Black Christianity redeemed American Christianity and America, and he does it through his use of scripture and theology. It's powerful, and I think the similar argument can be made of Adventism, that despite the realities of this difficult story that we're living through, Black American Adventism stayed. And the quote that I use at the end is Baldwin talking to his nephew from The Fire Next Time. We've not stopped trembling yet, but if we had not loved each other, none of us would have survived. And if integration means anything, this is what it means: that we, with love, shall force our brothers to see themselves as they are, to cease fleeing from reality and begin to change it. For this is your home, my friend, talking to his nephew. Do not be driven from it. I guess that's where I'd go with answering that. And Yi-Shen, that was rather subtle, or not so subtle, shifting the attention the way you did. Nicely done.
In a similar fashion, right? I'm talking about pastoral care and counseling, and I mentioned my work with working class Maya Mexicanos on the assembly line of a multinational corporation. The stories that they told me, right? I'm going to kind of round it there. The stories that they told me, how do I deal with those ethically, and how do they help me to be held accountable to some truth? The stories that came up over and over again, like, for example, and this is not something that I treat in this book. So now I'm like, I feel like I'm promoting a different book.
That's good.
Which is this chapter only gives you a sampling of what's in the larger work, which is Insurrectionist Wisdoms, is where there are multiple women who, their whole way of life has been decimated by this multinational corporation coming into town by design. Then the NAFTA agreement has made it so that all of their cornfields have been killed off, though they continue to mine those. In order to keep their families afloat, they're working and injuring their own bodies. I could go on, but the common stories that I heard were about their children crying out for leche, for milk. The stories about how they were lethal wages that they were being given, right? And so there's genocide on multiple levels. There's an epistemicide that says these women who haven't been educated, and by the way, can't read an Adventist pamphlet either, right? They have no wisdom. They have no truth. They have nothing to say, yet they are prophetic voices, right? That are naming and bringing to light the economic systems of death, and the fact not that they're poor, but that they are impoverished through the economic systems that we've kept there. And just in case I don't get the mic again, the only way we keep racism going is through the economic system that gives the benefits to those who keep them and the rest of us who continue to live enslaved.
Are there questions or comments that I see some hands? How do we handle that with the mic?
Repeat the question into the mic.
Oh, repeat it into the mic. Okay. We'll start with you.
Or are you looking at me?
Right behind you, and then we'll come to you next. I'll repeat it if.
Are inspired. I am working in Adventist healthcare. Adventist healthcare oversees Washington Adventist Hospital. That is now White Oak Medical. And I have a story to tell, and quoting Paul Harvey, the rest of the story of what happened when we discovered Lucy Byard's story and what our leadership team did. May I tell that
Please.
story?
Yeah, I think I want to.
Stand over there. Okay. I'm sorry. I didn't.
And I think this telling the story would really help us with some application, right? To the question or to answer the question, what do we do about this? What do we do about this? So I've been with Adventist Healthcare. My name is Ann Rhoda. I serve as the Vice President of Mission Integration for Adventist Healthcare. And I've been with the organizations for 7 years. 6 months into coming into this organization, our CEO, Terry Ford, who is a white man, received an email about Lucy Byard. He had no idea, and neither did our entire leadership team. A few people heard about it, but did not really understand what that Lucy Byard story was. And when our CEO found out that it happened on our region, in our hospital, he was absolutely devastated. And he asked Dr. Benjamin Baker to do research on exactly what happened. And a number of us, myself included, were part of really investigating and taking it down to the granular level of what really happened. Folks, let me tell you how chilling it is to sit in a conference room when Dr. Baker is giving his report and seeing up on the screen a microfilm of the board minutes of Washington Adventist Hospital, but at that time, yes, it was Washington Adventist Hospital, the board minutes in typed font that says, the board has made a decision to not accept Blacks in our hospital. That was chilling for us. And I'll tell you, it took us a year and a half to process this story, a year and a half to actually own it. I mean, I wasn't even born, right? It took us a year and a half to talk about it because it was hard. It was really hard. And to talk about this as a leadership team, it took us a year and a half to own it, to absolutely own it. And it was led by our CEO, Terry Ford, who says, we have got to own it. We have got to say, we have got to apologize. And we've got to do something about it that's tangible. So about 2.5 years ago, we commissioned a portrait of Lucy Byard. Simi Knox, African-American artist who actually lived in the area, we commissioned him to paint a portrait of her that now is displayed at White Oak Medical Center, which is the newer hospital of Washington Adventist Hospital. Here's the interesting thing. We found Lucy Byard's great-great-grandniece. Her name is Lisa Sweeney Walker, and invited her to the unveiling of that picture. But what we've also done here, and I'm not tooting our horn here, because let me tell you, it was a year and a half of real tough discussions and talking and confrontation and transformation, that we now have the Lucy Byard Scholarship, specifically for nursing students of color, so that we can give individuals who, have to work 3 jobs, to get to nursing school to finish their nursing degree. And so what we want to do is we want to eliminate that disparity and open the door for exceptional nurses of color to be able to finish their nursing degree. And if they so choose, they're not obligated, but if they so choose, they have a job at Adventist Healthcare. But to all your points that you brought out today, first of all, it's a journey, okay? It really is a journey. And it's a journey to understand the pain. It's a journey to understand the pain. It's a journey to own your part in this. It's even a journey to discover what is my part in this. And it's a journey that has to keep going. And we have to read the tough books, and we have to listen to the tough presentations, and we have to have these tough conversations. So where are we now with Lucy Byard? Well, first of all, we've got our second round of nursing students that we will be awarding their scholarship to next month. We're really excited about. Secondly, 3 years ago, Adventist Healthcare began to manage Howard University Hospital. Howard University Hospital is the hospital, which was Freedman's Hospital, where Lucy was transferred to when she was rejected from Washington Adventist Hospital. It is our hope, and we're praying and we're working this through, that Adventist Healthcare will acquire Howard University Hospital. A lot of tough negotiations. And in our journey in acquiring, and you know, we're still praying about this. The journey still continues. We had to confront the racial tension because it's a completely different culture to who we are in Adventist Healthcare. But it's a journey, and it's a conversations that we need to have. So I wanted to tell the rest of the story.
Yeah, thank you.
Because it's an important story I think all Adventists need to know, and I think all Adventists need to own. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would just say one thing struck me, that the shock with which the story was received when you discovered it. If I understand the Black community well, which is probably sketchy, but there's no surprise. None. This is day by day. There's no shock. What do we make of that? How is it the Adventist Church, some of us are just, it's a shrugged shoulder because that happens to us every day. Thanks for recognizing it. And others of us are just so shocked that we must do a year and a half of processing before we can even speak about it publicly. I don't know what to do with that.
Thank you. Let me take an online, and then I'll come to you next.
From Alan Reinach. I hear Marlene defining the pastoral mission in a more communitarian sense to require addressing structural racism through, in part, policy change. I would like to pledge the Pacific Union's Religious Liberty Department as a partner in this effort and urge one and all to advise about desired policy changes that we can assist with. So I would ask the panel if anyone has identified any specific policies the Adventist Church should roll up its sleeves and advocate.
Question for panelists. Any particular policies that you think the Adventist Church should roll up its sleeves? Alan Reinach is asking.
It's always tough when you talk about very specific policies that a church or religious institution should engage in. But I think one that should be relatively easy for us in principle, that is universal access to healthcare. Universal access to healthcare, that's built into the foundation of our church. That's why we're here, right here in Loma Linda, and we have what, 5 healthcare systems in the nation. I mean, we're committed to health and well-being, and in part out of a humanitarian perspective. And so, universal access to healthcare.
Thank you.
I'll add one. Yeah, I'll add one. So one of the things I would really like, I've been teaching now for 5 years over at La Sierra University, best place. I'm very happy with it. If I could, if I could make a request is, I would really love policy around the percentage of how many Adventists are employed in particular areas of the university and who gets tenure and who gets extended contracts. I'd like the two-tier system segregation done away with.
I see a lot of hands coming up.
Another idea.
Oh, what, another idea?
Please.
Thank you.
It's not a policy, but we do need to reflect on our larger absence of discussion around politics. We avoid it because it's divisive. There are legitimate bases for differing opinions. We all have different backgrounds, different experiences, family structures, ties. But I think sometimes when I look at the pastoral side and I'm in a church, knowing that Jesus is neither Democrat nor Republican, I know that Jesus isn't as important as being a Democrat or Republican. So let's start to think about. Did you hear that? Say it again. Jesus isn't as important as being a Democrat or a Republican. So we want to fight along these lines, and I think it's time that I want to encourage a Christocentric understanding of Christ as the Savior of all.
Thank you. You'll run it.
Just
All right.
Thank you, Yi-Shen. Bill Shaw. Thank you, Maury. I think your comment about universal health care is kind of the lead in to what I want to ask a question about and say something about, which has to do with K-12 education. K-12 education comes to my mind because I was just at my Academy class reunion 2 weeks ago. And it reminded me of the one I went to 10 years before that, when I looked up the principal and I told him, I think your school does not properly represent the racial demographic of the Adventist area. And he said, of course we do. And the discussion went on for about 5 minutes, hot and heavy, and I realized I probably shouldn't have brought up the subject. But I still felt that I was right. And I still feel that the issue is an important one. So I'm just going to bring it up here. And I want to say it in a few different ways and see if I can get some response. But I think as Adventists, we think of K-12 education as intrinsic. Almost all of us probably went to attended Adventist K-12. We don't think about this in the realm of economic or racial justice, do we? I mean, we just experienced it. So we don't think about it in terms of economic and racial justice, and I don't. And then I began realizing that I experienced my K-12 elementary education during the Watts riots. I lived 35 miles from the Watts riots. I know someone in this room who lived much closer. I don't know, Calvin, whether or not you had the same feelings I did about 3 miles. Yes. I was like 35 miles away out in Convener, and we were scared to death. And we had no idea why this was happening or what was really going on, except for that we thought our house was going to burn down soon. And I wish those Black people would stay away from us. That's really what we thought. Today, I'll ask a colleague who's gone to K-12 if they've heard of redlining. And most of my white American Adventist colleagues of my age or the last 20 years don't know what redlining is. Is it a concern of us Adventists that with our K-12 education, we educate these kids for issues like social and economic justice, critical race theory? Is this important to us? It's important to me that we teach them good science and that they learn how to accommodate their faith in Jesus Christ with their understanding of the age of the earth and humanity and so on. That's a struggle in itself. But I don't hear too much discussion about this subject. And I'm so glad, Greg, you are here because my academy is in your conference. But do we care about public policy in regards to non-Adventist K-12 education? Do we care enough so that we educate people that can serve in the public realm? Is Jesus coming soon so we don't have to worry about K-12 non-Adventist education? But I think that we don't even know the extent to which, because we probably haven't done the studies to determine the extent to which Adventist K-12 education is unjust economically, racially, and so on. The Temple Plan ended a long time ago. I don't know of a lot of ways in which we can systemically support an equal education for Adventist kids of all races and color and backgrounds. I think mostly I've covered what I wanted to say, ask, bring up. But have we ever asked these questions and in regards to the extent of economic injustice? And then I'm just going to finish by saying, Catherine here, my partner, told me when she met me that I went to a segregation academy. And I said she was nuts. And the more time passes, the more I recognize that there's truth to it. And that we might want to think about the extent to which our K-12 education grew tandem with the growth of Christian segregation academies in the South. And do we, to some extent or another, do we actually try to hide that fact in the way we live and lead our schools? Anyway, I'm going to.
Where were you in Southern California?
Should I say after all that long speech? I know where Calvin went. That was Linwood Academy, right? Can't miss that one. I went to St. Gabriel Academy. We played baseball with each other. Yes.
We have some hands.
I'm going to follow this.
Hi, first of all, I just wanted to thank you all for your participation today and for the book. I'm really looking forward to reading it. I think many others over the last few years, got to the point where I was very discouraged with our church. For one thing, the lack of this type of discussion from the pulpit, despite all the many things that were happening in our society. And I do need to say that the one thing that kept me strong in my faith was reading Black theologians and womanists. And I would just like to ask the question of all of us, which is, as tragic as some of these stories are that have happened in the last years, as tragic as the story of Lucy was, when is it going to happen? When is the Adventist Church going to be a place where we don't have to wait for people of color to be tragically murdered for us to start having these conversations? Because that's not the only place where racism is happening in our institutions. And I'm still not hearing about it from the pulpit. When are we going to see in our cradle rolls not pictures of white Jesus, but pictures of a brown-skinned baby who was an illegal immigrant and a mother of a woman who was having a baby out of wedlock? When are we going to hear about these stories, not just people who have died, but people who experience the the micro traumas of racism every day in our churches and schools and hospitals. When are we going to hear about that from the pulpit and discuss it in church? And from those people outside of the month of February? That's all I wanted to ask.
Mark Stoddart, I am so glad I decided to come to be here in person. This has been phenomenal. I want to just pick up a little bit on what you were talking about, Mark, the power of story. And as the panel was sharing, I want to identify with Maury and Andy as brothers in spit. As a teenager, that's a part of my story too. Only I come from England. And, just to emphasize how universal this problem is. Recently, in one of the cradles of American Adventism in Berrien Springs, I came across a story, and it's on YouTube now, so I'm hoping that you get an opportunity to look at it. But it's the Walter Douglas story. Walter Douglas was the first Black faculty in Andrews University. And he's being interviewed and shares his story of the struggles of a Black man in Berrien Springs. Not only was he the first Black professor, but he was also the first Black homeowner in Berrien Springs. And my brother over here brought up the story, with the idea of redlining. Well, Adventist redlining occurred in his experience, where he was trying to buy a house, and the realtor had to come back and tell him, I can't sell you that house because the owner doesn't want to sell it to a Black person. The owner is a white Seventh-day Adventist church from Pioneer Memorial Church, who got together with a bunch of other white Adventists in the basement of Pioneer Memorial Church and determined that they were not going to sell their homes to a Black person. The story's on YouTube, the Walter Douglas interview. So you can look at it and hear it from his own lips as he speaks this story through a broken voice. I think it's critical that and one of the things that I felt ashamed about was Dr. Douglas was one of my professors at Andrews, and I never thought to ask him about his journey. And I think if we would just take the time to ask people, tell me a little bit about your story. What was it like for you? I would have known this story. I mean, I ate at his house, for goodness sake. I would have known a little of this story before I heard it on the screen. So sharing our personal stories with each other, being bold enough to ask, how did you get here? Then we can maybe break down some of the barriers. We can begin to get comfortable with the discomfort of messy and begin to make changes that can have a powerful and sustainable impact. I don't know who was first. Okay.
Sorry.
And those of us who have been spitting on the face of God while waiting for the second coming, I'm sure when he finally shows up, we'll spit on his face, because it's the face that we recognize as the one that we've been spitting on. Old habits die hard. And that's probably why Jesus has come, and we're still waiting. That's it. Marlene, thank you for your specific examples of multinational and poor women workers, and for introducing or mentioning the word intersectionality earlier. I wonder, and this is not a question for any one person, if and when we are going to see a book on class and classism in Adventism, that would be a nice complementary sequel. And maybe we can put those books together into one volume sometime.
All right, just before we pick up with some more of the audience, and really we want to hear more from you all, because a part of the philosophy of the book was to actually not be prescriptive of how to talk about it, but to be descriptive of how we actually do talk about this conversation. So we're very grateful for that. But just for one of the online questions by C.A. Ricketts Jr., hello panelists, Kilborn et al. Present a process of health disparities research in 3 phases. 1 is detection, 2 is understanding, and 3 is elimination. And then the quote says, in medical ministry, page 259, it is stated the principles of health reform are found in the Word of God, is to be firmly linked with the ministry of the Word and has restoring influence. Micah 6:8 guides our justice behaviors. Panelists, please speak to Adventism's gospel responsibility for awareness, understanding, and intervention in the arena of health disparities. From your perspective, are we gaining momentum? Are we middling? Are we slowing down? What are your thoughts? Yeah.
Use that one. Yeah.
I would just observe that Adventists of all stripes, backgrounds, colors, ethnicities have been reading the text for a long time. Things don't change much. This is why I think, as practical theologians, the introduction of lived experience, and as was mentioned, thank you back here, beginning again after decades of broken trust following the Ford debacle, regaining the ability to have a constructive conversation and modeling that for the world and for our church is probably a useful matrix for getting back to something that resembles a biblical injunction on who we are as made by God and in Christ.
Follow up, and I thank you for that. And part of what your essay prompted in me, you write on page 174 in white supremacy culture, WSC, written text reigns over other forms of communication. Boy, if that doesn't describe Adventism, I'm not sure what does. Later, you say theologically, biblically, textually driven racism is no more godly than any other form of racism. And what I want to ask, I hope is provocative enough, and I hope you'll take it with some grace. Is the text itself racist, sexist, or is it our interpretation of it?
The church text is because we can't even get the name of our administrator. That's something that might not be able to work on.
So if I have time for two more questions,
Gentleman right here has
yeah.
had his hand up all the whole time.
Carla, and then I'll go to you.
Hi, I'm Carla, and I just want to say how nice it is to see your shining faces. Marlene, it's great to see you, and all of you did such a great job. Mark, I apologize. I was checking on my phone to see when the Lucy story happened, and my phone went off on its own. So that was my fault. But I want to ask you this. You know, my parents are from Appalachia, and the Hatfields and the McCoys, it was a real thing. It was a real thing. And there was basically has been no possibility of a future in sort of white Appalachia in some regions and areas and times until a new generation started intermarrying and loving each other and figuring out how to love and and live past the trauma rather than deal with the trauma. So I'm sitting here wondering, what would it be like if this conversation were happening with 20 to 40-year-olds or 15 to 25-year-olds? How would it be different? And I guess I want to ask the question, trauma is tricky and it's hard to deal with, especially intergenerationally, interculturally. Might it be possible that the real change will simply happen in the next generation? And is there a way that we could set them up well to do that?
Optimism is statistically absurd. Nonetheless, that's the point of being optimistic, right? That despite the data, we cling to hope. And part of what I say in my essay is that God calls, our faith calls for hope. That's part of the hardest, that for me, that's one of the hardest parts of my faith, is to not sink into the depression of what the real data shows. And that's just my only answer I could possibly posit.
Sorry, I had a visceral reaction, and my thing is no, 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 no. It just cannot wait for the next generation. And I have multiple reasons why not. I think it's urgent. I think when I talk about topological eschatology, I'm talking about how God is arising in the moment for me. It's the fact that mothers who I talked with who don't have milk for their children, they are sensing the future in the present and they need milk now. So no, it's also because I'm raising an Asian American daughter who's a first generation immigrant, and no, I'm not setting anything up for the next generation to then like work through the trauma. Life is traumatic currently. And I realize that it's tricky, and I rather have the tricky and messy conversation than please don't give me cruel aspirations of what to grasp at. I need something, even if it's small morsels, moving towards something. That's why we hit the streets and we protest. That's why we do petitions. That's why we're calling for policy change. It's got to be now. And I think if you talk to the generations you named, I think they are crying for a church to stop preaching, being there finding Christ and God and the Advent outside of our churches when our churches don't preach it and teach it.
So I'm not a theologian. I'm a public health community development guy, but also a past president of ADRA. And so I want to take us back maybe to Matthew 25, which is where ADRA people take us. You know, I was naked, I was hungry, I was thirsty. And you say, when did I do these things? You say, and as much as you did to the least of these, you did it unto me. And then my follow-up question to people is, so do you serve the poor in the hope that they'll see Christ in you? Or do you serve the poor because you see Christ in them? Because he told you that he was hungry, he was naked, he was thirsty, as much as you do it to them. And I wonder whether part of that ties into the church's view of racism as well, in that we want to bring people into our church. As I've defined it, I don't take the time to hear their story, because when I hear their story, I see the person, but I don't see the person. I want you to see me. And I wonder whether our whole approach to evangelism and other parts of spreading that gospel has really just been with a narrative with me at the center of the narrative and never putting the person in front of me at the center of the narrative.
Excellent. Oh, well, I want to say one of the areas where I grew in knowing a little better just about the community of Adventist theological thinking around the world. And like Andy, this brought me a lot of hope. But the hope was a hope that we could actually have real hard discussions and deal with a challenging text. I saw Rick, it's brought up the question of Micah 6. That's good as a verse. But then when you look at the whole chapter, you realize that it's a lawsuit. Yahweh is suing Israel, and they are appealing to processes that they could have. An offering of a lamb, 1,000 rivers of oil, etc. All of that is built into what they're, and then he's kind of dismissing that. It's almost like, in other words, our authors are taking serious the fact that the scripture has a contested tradition. One of, let me wash myself in Jesus and wash my sins away, and one of, do justice. And this idea that we can have a substitute, and Yahweh says no. Jeremiah says Yahweh didn't give those laws. Ezekiel says he gave those laws to horrify you. This is a contested tradition. And I have to say, Nathan is good in this sense. He has a better judgment than me, because I think there were some areas I wanted us to have a more critical conversation. And he said, Maury, we can have that, and I have some options, and we can get it published outside the denomination, and it can sit in libraries. Or maybe we can make it palatable for our community of faith and make some change. And as I'm hearing this conversation, I think he's right. There are some areas that could be tougher. I think we went soft on Ellen White. She has a mixed tradition. And we need to be mature enough to start talking about that candidly. But nevertheless, at least the conversation gets started. And I have appreciated hearing from you all as well. Thank you all again. I think we've run out of the time that we have, but we can always keep this going afterward over some tea or coffee.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I don't know about you, but I was blessed by this conversation and inspired, I want to thank all of you for taking the time to participate in this important conversation. We've asked tough questions. We heard vulnerable testimonies and witnesses, and for those who are joining us online as well. So thank you so much, and round of applause for our esteemed panelists again. And this concludes our panel today.